And we are live. Welcome to Poets House live streaming. My name is Paulo Vier, broadcasting tonight from Lenape Haking, specifically the unceded territory of the Rockaway, Canarsie, and Matinacock peoples, otherwise known as Queens County, New York City. I'm a poet and program director of Poets House, which joins with all peoples of conscience to express outrage and pain as crisis grips our nation. Rayshard Brooks, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and Ahmaud Arbery, murdered are just among the most recent victims of systemic racism and transphobia in our nation. I want to say personally that Black trans lives matter. Simultaneously, this week, we acknowledge the dreadful threshold of over 120,000 deaths from COVID-19, which, because of systemic inequity, inordinately impacts communities of color. Poets House acts on the belief that poetry bears witness, incites the language of mutuality and care, and by so doing insists on individual and collective action to bring about change. I also want to wish everyone a happy Pride Month, mindful of our courageous siblings in the struggle for equality in the month of June, marking the Stonewall riots. I am certain that the spirits of Bayard Rustin, Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, and Lorena Borjas are guiding the safety and well-being of all of our brothers and sisters taking part in demonstrations across our cities, our nation, and the world. Tonight's broadcast is the third and final program presenting scientists in conversation with poets. Really thrilled to welcome Rick Cech, field biologist, nature photographer, and co-author of Butterflies of the East Coast, An Observer's Guide, who will be engaging with award-winning poet Yanyi in a conversation about observation and ways of looking through nature and poetry, among other things that we will be discussing. Finally, a big shout out to Laura Manuelidis for her generous support of the series. We will start with Yanyi. Yanyi is a writer and a critic. In 2018, he won the Yale Series of Younger Poets Prize, awarded by Carl Phillips for his first book, the terrific The Year of Blue Water, published by Yale University Press. Currently, Yanyi is poetry editor at Foundry, poetry review editor at Public Books, and an MFA candidate at New York University. He formerly served as Director of Technology and Design at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, Senior Editor at Nat Brute, and Curatorial Assistant at the Poetry Project. Yanyi is the recipient of fellowships from the Asian American Writers Workshop and Poets House. Woohoo! Find his recent work in Granta, Tin House, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. Yanyi, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Over to you.
Thanks, Paolo, for the wonderful introduction. I am, among the other things in my bio, also sitting on a porch right now in Vermont and really enjoying the sounds of birds. So hopefully that will carry through for this program with Rick, who I'm very excited to speak with after our individual presentations. So I'm going to just get started. So what I'm reading is going to be a lyric essay that is part archival research and also like close reading of the late poet Linda Gregg's work, also kind of autopoetic work thinking about COVID and mostly around how poetry can speak to how nature is not only something that we look at and observe, but also something that I feel like poets have been really actively working on understanding as something that we also embody as people. In remembrance. Myths are stories about people who become too big for their lives temporarily, so that they crash into other lives or brush against gods. In crisis, their souls are visible. Anne Carson from Grief Lessons. Linda Gregg was known for giving students a writing exercise about looking at real things. Describe 6 things in the physical world without celebrating or ornamenting them. This was much harder than it sounds. Inevitably, a metaphor would creep in, a simile. Inevitably, the impulse from students to impress themselves over the things described prevailed at first. At first, I assumed these indiscretions appeared at moments during which a student wanted to seem beautiful or clever. But I'll go even further. It could also be that the students who wanted to be among the things seen and didn't know how. It could be that the students didn't know that they were already among the things. I was telling Linda this story, how one of my friends just kind of said, "Why not just leave that baby bird there? It'll be eaten by a cat or, like, let nature take its course." And Linda said to me, she says, "Aren't we nature?" Quoted from Timothy Veal. Fish, fish, white sun, tell me we are one and that it's the others who scar me, not you. Linda Gregg. I'm afraid of nature. I'm afraid of a virus I can't see. Because I can't see the virus, I'm afraid instead of other people, including you. Aren't you nature? I want to tell you a story, but I've not yet the words. Emily Dickinson called her poems her letter to the world, not her meeting or her embrace. Greg. I choose the letter only as a substitute because we cannot embrace. The rhapsodist and the poet have knowledge, but they do not possess it. Rather, they are possessed by the power of the muse who inhabits them. Susan Stewart. Doctor. You see, her eyes are open. Gentlewoman. Aye, but their sense is shut. My lyric possession. I'm familiar with gazing into a space between objects, between places, between times, when language is only its adumbration. Words are either forgotten or not yet found, sometimes both. The difference only seems to be the time and order of memory. There in the elsewhere, outlines of words are metered, pitched, not music, but a shared root. The rhythm of talking that can't be made out. Music and meter have an overdetermined semantic reference, a meaning, that they bear forward in time regardless of whether at any given moment the poet or reader can explain or refer to such a meaning. Susan Stewart. I can barely think, traffic rushing past me toward Manhattan's approaching skyline, my phone and my navigation slumping then falling to the car floor. I'm terrified. I'm at 60 miles per hour for the first time on this bridge. I have to do this. I have to pack up my apartment in New Jersey in a week so my partner and I can afford to quarantine outside of New York for the foreseeable future. But I couldn't find parking in Brooklyn. I dropped off my sister without giving her a hug. I saw but didn't touch my brother for the first time in 2 months, haggard quarantine beard and all. It's okay because I'll be dropping them off at the airport in a few days. In about 48 hours, I'll discover that the car's engine overheated and a major part needs to be special ordered and repaired. Because of the mail being delayed, it's impossible for me to know when the car will be ready, the mechanic says. What happened to me feels like something that exists between words, a subcategory of expression for which there's no one easy expression. Paisley Rickdahl. Circling the block around my apartment for nearly an hour, near tears, too much stuff in the car to safely leave it without unloading it, it is endlessly night. Even after I park, unload a little, sleep, I'll wake up at 3 a.m., heart pounding because I've forgotten the cleaning products. The only strict antithesis to prose is meter, nor is this in truth a strict antithesis, because lines and passages of meter so naturally occur in writing prose that it would be scarcely possible to avoid them, even if it were desirable. William Wordsworth. In prose, at least, I might get to a naturally occurring poetry. The poet needs, in two senses of the phrase, a continuing reader, someone who can make the poem intelligible within the social and historical context in which it is a continuum with other poems, and the poet himself or herself as changing reader of his or her practice of time. Stewart again. What kind of seeing was she really talking about? What did she want? Helena de Groot. Well, I think, for example, in this poem she says, towns without roofs on the houses. This is Timothy Veal on Linda Gregg. Right. It's so plain, but it's so rich, because what does that mean? Towns without roofs on the houses seems to suggest to me that once there were roofs. And where are they now? Writing without is to speak into the negative. Silence gives substance to the poem in the way that death gives in life, Greg quotes from Jack Gilbert. Roofless, looking at the stars. My first time reading Stewart's lyric possession, I linger over her analysis of Hardy's The Voice, because it reminds me of a line from Greg. Underlying the series as a whole is the expression of grief as inaudibility, writes Stewart. Greg writes, "Sweet being, if you are anywhere that hears, come quickly. I weep, face set, no tears, mouth open." If anybody wept, the sound of their cries was contained within their vehicles. Los Angeles Times. Is this the death that Gilbert imagined that would infuse life? In the face of death, I am not in silence. I am facing death, which brings muteness. Paisley Rickdahl's Nightingale, a gloss, is cut up, fragmented, and buried. I first read it a year ago, struggling to decide if I ever wanted to write about the emotional abuse of a past relationship. Silence as Philomella's flailing tongue. The whole attack is conducted in silence, she writes. Who is to say that the reverberations don't also continue in silence, in being forced from speech? Only language which orders time and gives experience shape and meaning might control how violence is experienced. It gives us back control. Rickdahl. I read Linda Gregg because I want to be possessed by the humanity in her that wanted to write about other people's roofs. Ventriloquism is characterized by speaking from the body or trunk of the body rather than the head, projecting a voice from or across a distance, projecting spatially and, in the metaphor of possession, temporally as well. This voice is distinguished by its origin in another place. Stewart. I'm on Twitter, but I enter a room with a COVID patient on a ventilator. I'm wearing a hazmat suit. I shuffle across, turn on an iPad. A gallery of people load on the screen like a chorus. I move the iPad screen within view for and of the patient. The chorus is speaking, crying, saying goodbye. The deceased doesn't know the difference during this period, but the living do. John Wenig, funeral home president. In a moment of calm after nonstop days of emergencies, my body's suddenly shut down. The weight being lifted from my shoulders is my point of collapse. Going, allowed to collapse. I read an article comparing the cases of two young women who are Chinese healthcare workers. One of them dies and the other one lives. Both made a turn for the better, but then one of them died of a cytokine storm. Botswain. A cry within. A plague upon this howling. They are louder than the weather or our office. With a cytokine storm, the patient effectively drowns at the hands of their own immune system. Total collapsed, named a storm. Aren't we nature? I know of two cases. A train operator nearly tripped over one while walking between cars. The other person was sitting upright on a bench right outside the conductor's window and discovered to be dead only at the end of an 8-hour shift after my coworkers kept noticing the person on each trip. Sujatha Gidla, MTA conductor. Like the car, I know so little of what my body is capable of. With Greg, I'm trying to remember a kind nature, not a destructive one that holds the fragility of my body and the bodies of others. Footnotes pile up. I access sites more than once, but the sources themselves change each day. The foot of the articles relay, "This is a developing story." This is not a day book or a commonplace book, but a thinking book. a book written to remember references, a thinking memory. To set out to alter or displace references in a poem is to attempt, by mastering contingency itself, to master completely the situation of writing. What is more relevant to the situation of the phantom are the ways in which a return to certain musics and rhythmic form in one's writing signals the possibility of a recovered somatic meaning. Stewart. Considering the quote from Stewart above, I'm confused about whether I am the phantom or the poet, whether the phantom is supposed to possess the poet or the poet is supposed to possess the phantom. Thinking back to March, mere months ago, I too am motivated by a recovered somatic meaning. Does that make me a phantom? This is history right in front of us, Garrett said. Did we go back to normal after 9/11? No. We created a whole new normal. We securitized the United States. We turned into an anti-terror state. And it affected everything. We couldn't go into a building without showing ID and walking through a metal detector, and couldn't get on airplanes the same way ever again. That's what's going to happen with this. Laurie Garrett, the prophet of this pandemic. The only way I can write the essay is if any and all the references can make it in as I think of them, if I study away from conclusions, if I allow the essay to be interminable as the history unfolding in front of me. Every couple of months I remember a night when Tracy Morris says that the first words spoken were likely utterances of awe for fires, mountains, natural disasters. Oh! I want so much to have the energy to notice and remember how nature includes awe. A cry of love or terror, a mimicry of its parents or an invention all its own, a flourish it will teach to its offspring, its own embellishments branching through the ancient notes. It is the sound of time. It is the sound of time passing. To set out to alter or displace references in a poem is to attempt, by mastering contingency itself, to master completely the situation of writing, Stewart says. The references piling up certain voices. To write them down is to alter them, but instead of displacement, they're sails carrying along bodies to the shores of other bodies. Recovered somatic meaning. Recovered somatic meaning. Recovered somatic meaning. The wind that sets to be in Emily Dickinson's poetry, for example, is it her breath? I don't think so. There's very little natural breathing in her poems. Greg. A man describes trying to breathe with coronavirus, knowing the air was there but grasping for it violently. But Greg Dickinson's unnatural breathing isn't coronavirus, it's God. I think she has let something like God's will into her poetry. Breathing as the meter of prose, breathing deep as a gorge or lithe as the needle step of an egret, the space and meter of poetry. If Greg uses lyric to describe anything in her essays or lectures, I do not have it at hand. She does, however, talk about magic in her 2015 lecture, Craft of the Invisible. If there's not magic somewhere in a poem, it is probably not a poem. Probably it is a short piece of prose with lots of ornaments. Magic usually changes things into something else, or it somehow makes an apparition or spirit exist for a while. The magic makes the reader experience what is being told. In the same lecture, Greg calls magic a combination of the unnatural, the sacred, and the impossible. And to get there, try to write a poem that you know you can't write. Only then does the mind stutter and evacuate language. True magic, she continues, deals with essences. It is the difference between similes and metaphors, Disco and Ray Charles. Greg's magic is poetry containing the unnatural, sacred, and impossible. A new world order brings a new sense of natural. It's magic to learn how to see in it. To write just because the poet wants to write is natural, but to learn to see is a blessing. The art of finding in poetry is the art of marrying the sacred to the world, the invisible to the human. Greg. The invisible, yes, this virus, must be married to the human. The nightingale hovers between trauma and memory, says Richtel. I hear the sound all through the air that was her eating, but it is on its own now, completely separate from her. I think I am supposed to look. I am not supposed to turn away. I am supposed to see each detail and all expression gone. My God, I think, if paradise is to be here, it will have to include her. Thanks.
Thank you, Yanyi. Pretty amazing to actually have the simultaneity of your words on Linda's work and her own words and other poets' words on Linda Gregg, and hear nature behind you. You can't really plan for that. That's poetry right there. Looking forward to our conversation later. For now, I am so pleased to be welcoming Rick Cech, an active field naturalist, author, and photographer. Rick is a curator at the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History and Entomology and past president of the Linnean Society of New York. He is the author and photographer of Butterflies of the East Coast, an observer's guide published by Princeton. Rick teaches at the New York Botanical Garden and gives programs on varied topics at numerous nature associations. So pleased to welcome you to our program tonight, Rick Cech, everybody.
Thank you, Paulo. Thanks very much. I'm still turning over in my mind Yanyi's fine comments. One of the things that stuck with me, I'm a naturalist, by the way, and what you're about to hear is a lot different than the poetry and some of the introspections that you just did. But I think at the end of the day, one thing that we have in common is that we're both seeking a kind of magic. And I'd like to take a few minutes to try and say what the kind of magic that we look for as naturalists. Now, starting from the top, I don't have much time here, so I'll hit some high points. But you say, what's a naturalist? Well, I hate to say it, but a naturalist is a person who engages in natural history as an avocation or as full time. The definition, of that, most people get down to frogs and toads and snakes, but I have a very special definition that I've been using for a long time that I think works, which is natural history is an oral folk tradition. And it's an oral folk tradition which has lived on, and people have passed on knowledge and kept it going for more than 500 years. For most of that time, it was done without benefit of computers or emails or anything else, although now it uses those things in Zoom and a lot of other vehicles. But where it really began is something I want to sort of share with you and share with you what it's like to sort of be a naturalist. Okay, there's several kinds of naturalists or people who get involved with it. One is just a naturalist per se. You can see some of my friends here. They're spending their time studying some things. You also get natural scientists. As I'll say a couple of times, this is what we do is not science. Science is a very strict and disciplined thing. The fellow here in the picture is Ernst Mayr. I met him at 100. He was one of the more famous natural scientists that there was. And talk about nature preserves. If I could live to be 100 and could speak as clearly as he did then, I would be very pleased. Now, I should say there's also naturists, and I should hope it's not disappointing to anyone if, in fact, this program doesn't have anything about naturists in it, but it won't. So if you felt that way, you should perhaps go on to something else. Now, I know a lot of naturalists, and most of the serious naturalists I know, essentially were born that way. Or we developed a kind of rapt fascination with nature in our very early years. Now, interestingly, that's something that you can do as a very young person, because all it takes to be a naturalist is to have some natural object and to have an inquisitive disposition towards looking at it and spending time. It doesn't require any special tools initially. So when I was a young boy, I would do things like run around and draw pictures of the bark of different local trees and try and compare them. I never saved those diagrams. I actually wish I had. But the problem is that when you're 5 to 7, no matter how much you do those things, you don't really know what you're looking at. And that's where the oral tradition comes in. When I was 10 or 11, I started going over to a local nature center where a fellow named Clinton Barter, who I show you here, was the caretaker. He was a fine old-time naturalist, one of the a kind that you find very seldom any longer. And at that age, I was very interested in snakes. And so I'd always go over to him and I'd say, gee, did you see any snakes today? And he would say, oh, yeah, I saw a snake up at the end of the trail up here. And he would walk me up through the trails. And along the way, he would say, oh, you see that fern over there? You know what that fern is? It's a Christmas fern. It looks like a little stocking. Do you know what that is? That's a tree, particular tree. That's a wildflower. This is this bird. That's that small mammal. We got to the end of the trail, and I have to say we never ever found the snake that we were looking for. But in the course of his teachings, I became a pretty good young naturalist by the time it was all done. And the picture I'm showing you now is one I took at that age of the woodlands that he taught me to love for all of the various things that were in them. Where do we go with that? Eventually, you have that interest, and I have a little bit of knowledge. But what do we do with poetry? It's a little bit easier in a sense, because I can tell you that a poet is someone who writes poems. With naturalists, we do all sorts of different things, and there's no one thing we do that distinguishes us. We spend time in the field, we keep notes, we photograph and do drawings, we teach others. There's a variety of things that you may find us doing. One of the keys that sort of holds the discipline together is the idea of studying. You see some people here, and that's what naturalists do pretty much, is study, and that's what we enjoy doing. I've taken a jaundiced view of that in the quote that I've just put up here on the screen, which is that a naturalist is someone who pokes around curiously in a field or woodland with occasional flashes of excitement, but otherwise doesn't appear to be doing very much. And if you'd like to take it that way, that's true, but we can enjoy it on our own terms. I'm personally known for being an active field naturalist. I leave trips, I take pictures, and I do things of that sort. In order to go from where I was as a boy to get further, I needed to go back to the well of the oral folk community once again, and learn a trade or learn a skill. In the old days, that would have been taking a quill pen and drawing images of things, but today it was photography. And here I was with Russ Kinney, a professional nature photographer who taught me how to do that. By the age of 14, I took this raccoon picture. Shortly afterwards, I won a couple photo contests, and I sold my first professional picture at 15. I actually thought of being a naturalist rather than going to college at one time. But decided not to. So what have I done since instead? Well, I will lead a lot of trips. I've led hundreds of them. I've led a society, did a local checklist, wrote a large book about butterflies to the East Coast. And then lately I've done folding guides, which help people who don't know much about it learn how and become involved. And so that's sort of my story. That's what I've done. And there's hundreds other like it. But the question is, where did this all start? How did this community grow? You can follow the community back to at least Aristotle, 350 BC. And Aristotle was the first person we know of who made natural history a kind of a study, a focus of something to study or pay attention to. He never made it into something that lived after him, and so it died off. The next time that it surfaced was in the Renaissance. Aristotle was remembered only from a few parchments. Natural history began when some of the medieval people wanted to find some of the old herbs from antiquity, medicines and herbs, things that might have cured viruses, who knows. They realized that these old texts were the only things that they had, and they didn't know where to even to find them initially. So they formed one of a discussion group around this. Now, in those days, a discussion group was all conducted in Latin. It was all very hoity-toity, and it was only the educated people who were allowed in. And that would be true of most of the things at that time. Natural history from the start was a little bit better than that, because they got in apothecaries and local field people to go find the plants and to deal with some of the medicinal properties of them afterwards. So even though it was not what you would want to call a populist movement, it did start off being a little bit more inclusive for its time than other traditions. It also was one of the first to recognize women, although that took a long time in those days for that to happen. And here I show a picture of Marion, who in the 1600s was the best naturalist of her day, and she was recognized as such. You say, well, gee, that was a long time later. That took a long time. But on the other hand, if you think of Marie Curie, who was considered to be the woman who broke into science, that didn't happen for a couple hundred years later. So even though this was not a tradition that you that started off being very broadly based, it's always led the way a little bit. And I guess I can mention that when we had a confrontation in Central Park recently between a dog walker and someone trying to enforce the laws, we were very happy that the protagonist of that, the fellow who's on the right side, a minority guy named Chris Cooper, was a bird watcher. He was one of us, so we all took a lot of pride in that. Natural history moved along. And it moved along when it got popular, and suddenly people from different areas started to study it, not just from Italy. And they started to notice that the plants growing, like in the Netherlands or Germany or somewhere else, were different than the plants growing in Italy. And so they basically had to come up with a way of describing them and to communicate with each other. And three things came out of that. A tradition of field study, because they had to go into the field for the first time to see what was there. The second thing was ways of describing things, standardized ways, very strict. And then the third was a community where they would send letters back and forth to each other. And so that was the makings of the community. The third thing that happened, and this was unexpected, was when the Europeans set off to what they called the New World at the time, there was great excitement about the voyages of discovery. And suddenly new kinds of creatures and plants and goods and everything else came flooding back, and it became a very popular thing. To the point that the great nobles of the day all had to have obligatorily their cabinets. Now, cabinets started off being small, but then they became these large things, like this one in Naples from 1599. You had to have a letter of introduction to go see them, and they were all very fancy. And that was sort of the heyday of Renaissance natural history, if you want to call that a heyday. The excesses and the excesses of that era led to the next phase, which was that a lot of the commoner people just basically said, well, we don't want all of that fancy. We really don't want all that fancy stuff. We just really want to go out in the field and do our thing. And so the community moved along and developed a tradition of seeing things and of continuing to develop until today. You have all sorts of people involved from all sorts of places. Travel's easier, and it's something that has now grown to be really quite a large endeavor, a community that literally is worldwide. The thing that's important here is that there are certain core values of this community. The core values are firsthand experience. You're expected to go out and do things on your own. You're expected to report back what you found, and there's ways of doing that. And there are people who are good at it, and you're judged by your exactness. You're expected to pass along what you found, and your reputation in the community is established not by sort of who you are or what your background is, but by how well you do what it is. So it's very open in that regard. But the most important thing, perhaps, is that there's a devotion to knowledge for its own sake. Most naturalists that I know are not utilitarian in any way about it. In fact, they're maybe anti-utilitarian or anti-commercial about it. They really are there because they'd like to see nature in its own terms. In fact, as I have talked about it and written about it a couple of times myself, the key to being a naturalist, the thing that moves us at a deeper level, is the sense that we would like to be seeing nature as it is if we weren't there. We would like to essentially take ourselves out of the equation. Creatures have a certain integrity to them. They're not self-conscious. They're acting as what they do. There's a kind of truth in that. And to a sense, we're distrustful of some of our own human capabilities, just twist reality and imagine things and have it all work out the way we would like it to be. We're looking for something, that in a way is more essential when you get into a natural world. We find a lot of satisfaction in that. Now, initially, on the surface, that seems to be pretty antithetical to some of what you see in poetry, where you're going to have a metaphor, which is basically looking at some object in the world and then impressing upon it lots of themes and similarities and human passions and other things. And I'm aware that that's not all poetry, but there's a good portion of it which is that, and that is something naturalists are approaching it from a very different way. We're trying to look at the thing and try and find the thing for itself. Now, I guess we're not that different in the end, because I think there's a few things we do that are definitely aimed at the same target. One of the things is we're both seeking beauty. And I put up here a slide of a few of the things we look at. We like to look at things that are beautiful. And that's something poets like, that's something we like. And it's not just the organisms, though. We also like something like a forest, tropical forest, or the solemnity of a northern boreal forest after dark. Those are things that move us, very deeply, as well as they would move a poetic imagination as you imagine it. You can see a lot of things when you look at a chipmunk. When I look at a chipmunk, I see millions of years of evolution, which has made a chipmunk just a chipmunk, as opposed to something else that it might be. If it had evolved in a different environment, maybe it wouldn't be a chipmunk anymore. Maybe it would look something different. Wouldn't have a tail. Who knows what the differences might be? And you think, well, gee, that's science, pretty much. But what we're trying to do is to look at what's there and see deeper through it. And so then I go back to John Ruskin's comment, which is more poetic in nature, which is nature is painting for us day after day pictures of infinite beauty, if only we have eyes to see them. And I think that's really true both of ourselves and of poets. It's kind of a joining ground between the two. And finally, I guess I'd end with the idea that for naturalists, there is a wonderment in nature and in the natural world. And I'm going to throw up a very familiar quote from Gatsby. I'll pick up: as an aesthetic contemplation they neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate with their capacity for wonder. And I guess the happy news is that for naturalists, there's that sense of wonder every day. And I suspect the same is true of good nature poets as well. And that's pretty much what I can say quickly about what it's like to be a naturalist.
Thank you so much, Rick. Thank you so much, Yanyi, for your incredible presentations. Now we can talk together. And immediately, what I'm struck by, Rick, in your presentation on if it's not a science, I don't know what to call it, a practice, a passion, a vocation, being a naturalist. But whenever I think about naturalist, I'm immediately thinking of Darwin, who also was a biologist and a geologist. But with Darwin, what struck me as a poet was his language. But it strikes me from your presentation talking about poetry that there might be some hesitation on or reservation on your end about poets and how they have taken up the natural world in their poetry. Who are some of the poets you might be thinking about in this respect? Are there poets who you think are go-to poets for you in terms of keeping it real with the natural world?
I have to say that when knowing that I was going to be doing the naturalist side for the poet side, I probably exaggerated the differences that I think exist between the two. You mentioned Darwin, for example, and I'll speak to that for just a second. Darwin was a good example of someone who's both a naturalist and a natural scientist. And that's a boundary that really is hard to draw. In fact, the boundary is so hard to draw, it's sort of, is it even worth trying to draw it? Naturalists love expressive poetic thought. There's nothing about that's difficult. But the kind of thing that can cause us to sort of stand back a little bit is when nature is not portrayed accurately in order to fit it into a metaphor. I still may enjoy it, but it's not. But it sort of doesn't sit well with me when I have my naturalist hat on. Okay, just one example. Whitman, and he did a fine poem in which he had the hermit thrush singing all night long. The fact is, hermit thrushes don't do that. Some of the traditional nature poets, someone like Wordsworth, you read Tintern Abbey, and it's touted as a nature poem, but if you look at it, it's really mostly about people and people's sentiments. It's mostly about churchyards, not wild settings, and it kind of conflates anything that's sort of rural and pastoral with natural. And those are all fine things, but to me, there's a difference between that and what I would think of as really nature. And so, good nature poetry to me is poetry that looks at nature as it is, and finds a poetic meaning within it.
Yanyi, your thoughts on Rick's distinctions that he's making here vis-a-vis your presentation on a poet for whom nature was a start and really not the end for a whole different experience of language.
I was working on that essay about Linda before I knew that I was going to be doing this, and it's kind of interesting how I'm seeing kind of similarities between the practice of being a naturalist that Rick is talking about, and that practice that I talked about at the very beginning of the essay, where she was really asking students to look at the world around them as it is and not as they think it is. And they're being that's the think in my sentence just now being kind of where Rick may be talking about, is where the metaphor is, or where the human voice appears in a poem like Tintern Abbey, where that poem is about a dress and the human voice being able to express something versus necessarily like the natural space around the person, and is kind of an example of that kind of pastoral rural poem that was accessible to mostly the English elite who are able to access that kind of countryside anyway. I think Rick would probably enjoy a lot of what we may call eco poetry, and like the type of nature poetry that is based on thinking around poetry being environmental and including the environment, and also being environmentalist of thinking about the planet not just in terms of how we might build more extractive capitalistic machines onto it, but thinking about what's happening to the planet because of what we're doing. That's kind of one of the things that I'm interested in as a poet as well, of what is nature poetry now? Like, can it really be nature poetry if we think about it without people and without the things that we are doing to the environment? I would say there's a whole slew of like a lot of especially Bay Area poets who are doing really great work about it. A poem that comes to mind that is kind of a more well-known eco poem is one by Juliana Spar, Gentle Now, that kind of does the work of what I was just talking about, of like going through sitting by a stream and then also seeing all these different kinds of litter coming through the stream, and trying to do what Wordsworth is doing actually in Tintern Abbey, but not quite being able to do that while witnessing these other things that are going on.
I can't actually think of a more momentous time to be a naturalist than now, given the social distancing norms that have taken over. At the same time, a terrifying moment to be a naturalist because of what one can expect to not see when they go out in nature. A new consciousness about the absence of the person, of the human, right? In this natural environment, just because you're socially distancing yourself, but it's the Anthropocene. Before we get to this moment that we're in, the pandemic, I wanted to talk about language, which seems to me the place where both the naturalist and the poet finds common ground, but also where they naturally deviate. Because for a naturalist, whom you prefaced earlier, Rick, saying it's not really science, it's not scientific, but scientific language is so cardinal, I mean, so foundational, so immediate to their profession and their practice. But for a poet, right, the Latinate word is really but a beginning, and language really is a space for a poet to move. The closing down of the meaning of the word is antithetical to that right side of the brain that a poet operates in. And it really, depending on the poet, they can unpack a word and play with the word and really have the word mean different things, which is the exact opposite tendency and practice of a naturalist.
I guess for some reason, the first thing that's coming to mind is not my poetic practice, but my photographic practice of like, I kind of specifically decided to try and pick an art that like has nothing to do with language. I'm very interested in the observational, but something that I've often noticed is that whenever I take a picture of a thing, like a landscape, I do a lot of plant photography actually. I usually notice that it's the photographs that I just decided to take kind of as a like, oh, like here's something that is kind of interesting for me, and like it's probably been done before, but it's not that cool. Versus when I take a photo of a beautiful landscape, it's always when I develop the photography, the photos of the beautiful landscape that seem boring to me, and the photos of the plants that are actually the most interesting. And I feel like there's a kind of a, a similar thing that happens in poetry for me, where in my first book was a book of prose poems, and in this essay that I read, I'm kind of assimilating or putting together all of these disparate experiences that seemed notable to me, but are all part of this practice of observation, and putting them together, like, and figuring out where exactly is it's not so much in the specific word, but in the collage of words and in the collage of meaning making that one creates, one might call a poem. So maybe to get a little closer to your question of like if an instance when I would use a word kind of like a natural word like stone outside. When I use the word stone, I'm not just using the word stone. I'm also kind of bringing up all of its um, associations with mythology and with kind of the metaphors that have come before it. Um, because when you use language, you're also speaking to the history of language itself, not just to the thing that it represents. But when I take a photograph, I really am just taking a photograph of this fern most of the time. And it does reference a bunch of other photographs. And like if I wanted to be like an art photographer, in that context, it probably would. But in my practice as a photographer, I'm just taking photos and they don't mean anything aside from the things that they are. And with a word like stone, sometimes when I use that, it's about creating this ecosystem of a poem that is supposed to bring up not just kind of as Susan Stewart says in the essay in that I quote, it's not just the meaning of the word or the representation of the word, but a word has a sound, it has a literary association, and it also has even a look on the page, which I think more and more as we read on the page more, we're more likely to experience poetry visually as well. So yeah, I guess that's my simple-ish answer to your question.
Thanks. And how about you, Rick?
Yeah, well, if that was a simple answer, I hate to hear mine. When I talked about our naturalist's distrust of the human ability to sort of warp things, I guess that is sort of at the first level of the expression, it's sort of like well begun is half done, but poorly begun can't get anywhere. It isn't going to be successful. And if you start with a poem that has a natural allusion or it has a natural object within it, stone, whatever, if you don't really start with what that is, something essential about it, um, and you're going to then not be necessarily building on a strong basis. The afterwards, the addition of other things, then bringing other metaphors and other things into it, that's not something that is I mean, that's the heart of poetry, is to find other things that sort of mean the same. Like I think of the stone and plumbing back all of the thing with rushing forward of all the things that stones mean. I guess the real thing I was struck by was his comment about his casually taken pictures. There's several of the pictures I put in the deck that I just had today, and throughout the pictures I take, a significant number of my very, very favorite shots that I've ever taken were things that happened at the moment. Just random moments that I happened to pick up. And I think maybe there's something about discovery, whether it's visual or whether it's in words, that's at the heart of both what you're doing if you're really a devoted naturalist, but it also has a lot to do with what you're doing, I think, if you're a poet.
I have to bring up Bob Ross because you mentioned painting earlier, Rick Cech. But Bob Ross, if you both will remember with me, right, he would have these PBS programs where he would try and paint scenes from nature. But it's very clear to us who are studying how he does it, and anyone who studies painting, it's actually not nature, it's paint. And similar to poetry, right? Like you're trying to observe and capture what you're seeing, but foundationally, you're really committed to language and the experience of language and the subjectivity of it. And that leads to my next question. You brought up Chris Cooper, Rick, and that horrendous experience with Amy Cooper, forever known as Karen. But it did bring up something that is on my mind almost often when I think about naturalists, right? And the history of colonialism, the history of social constructivism, determinism, right? And it's no coincidence that Teddy Roosevelt's statue is coming down from the Museum of American Natural History. That I always thought was an offensive statue of Teddy Roosevelt, who was also an imperialist. But any thoughts on perhaps the paradox of being a naturalist, which is tied to observation and therefore your own subjectivity, if there's no experimentation, and the troubled history of social, constructionism and determinism. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
And where you don't see a lot of women historically, and you certainly don't see people of color, right? You don't see LGBTQ figures in how we proceed with a remembrance of the achievements in this field. And in this particular moment, that Chris Grouper moment is just reminded me about bird watching and the white supremacist history of that.
Yeah.
So any comments, both of you?
I remember being a kid, and I always loved going to the Museum of Natural History. But one of the things that, because I like I like the wild world. I like the natural world. One of the things that kind of freaked me out, and I guess it was the first time that I actually became aware of this overlay in our culture, was when I started seeing, some of the primitive villages, and things like that, primitive cultures, and they were being treated in the museum almost as though they were a natural artifact, as though they were sort of something else. And a lot of the language around the voyages, you'll notice that I mentioned the European voyages of discovery, what they call the New World. I mean, it wasn't the New World; it was already there. People were already there. People were living in it. I think it's. I don't think it's to the. I like anthropology is wonderful, but that's a study of cultures. I think some of what you would see in natural history museums is it was kind of offensive to me even before I knew that it was something you were supposed to be offended by. In fact, it confused me as much as it offended me. I mean, just why are people in here? What is, and that's different from wanting to study nature separately, but why were people considered part of that? And if you look at the modern natural history movement, I think you're going to see there's a lot more people. Go to Prospect Park in Brooklyn and go to one of the bird walks one of these times. I think you're going to see there's a lot of people in minorities of all sorts of people from all kinds of backgrounds, women all over the place in that practice. I mean, women have been the backbone of much of the natural history, and so I look forward to it being increasingly inclusive. Because there's no reason it shouldn't be, and I just hope that that some of the historical aspects don't cause people to turn away from it and to not find some of the things that are valuable in it.
How about you, Yanyi?
It's a great question, and it's definitely something that's been on my mind as we have been kind of ramping up into this program. Lots of things come to mind. I guess the first thing that I would say is that I'm sure that there were naturalists who are just not recognized in the naturalist tradition. Like, there are probably there are traces of it going back to Aristotle, but I'm sure there are undocumented or just not as studied histories of naturalist kinds of observation, or maybe not naturalism or observation, but certainly medicine cultures, agricultural cultures, different ways of living with and around and with nature that I would say indigenous cultures probably have a lot to talk about. I think also nature has been, just to speak about in America, some stories that I think about are just thinking about slavery in America, how seeds were carried in women's hair when they were being kidnapped to be sold in the slave trade as a kind of hope, and that's why we have certain kinds of plants in the United States. That's something that I recently learned that I think is really valuable to hidden history to think about. Also, the idea of what is a nature poem that is not written from the perspective of a colonial of a colonist or really a white person or a white man. Again, just thinking about like Black poetry, for example, were there not that many like Black naturalists, or were all Black people in the United States just slaves working the actual land? They didn't have time or energy to be actually leisurely looking at things because they were so up front and center with it. Is something that I think about. There's definitely histories of. Oh, I'm also reading Parable of the Sower right now, by Octavia Butler, and I'm thinking a lot of myself about like what it means to be connected to the land, and like, is there a reason why me as like an Asian person, I haven't, like, it hasn't just been part of my upbringing or my immigration story that I like lived in the middle of Vermont, for example, where I am right now. Like, I think that also has to do with like migration patterns and the ways that people decide, or the reasons why people decide to immigrate. My grandpa actually like does like herbal medicine, like Chinese herbal medicine, but none of that tradition has really gotten down to me for various reasons. So I think that there's also like kind of in the story of colonialism, the story of intergenerational knowledge that has not been passed down because people were killed or disappeared or sent to labor camps or were told to kind of like up and go to live a different kind of lifestyle because of capitalism and colonialism and imperialism.
In addition to thinking about the cultures that have been overridden by Western colonialism, right? I mean, perhaps the one basic area where you see hegemony in place is in language, like the naming of nature. Who names it? Whose language makes it official? Who renames the terms that indigenous peoples here have been using? Perhaps there's more of this space for poetry and the poem and the troubling of language in a natural scientist's vocation. Unfortunately, we are out of time. And as ever, we are just scratching the surface of this meaningful conversation between two great minds. Rick, thank you so much for being a part of this. Yanyi, I'm looking forward to your next book.
Well, thank you too.
Thank you very much. This is great. Very fun.
Peace.
Thank you. And for all our viewers tonight, as ever, I'm grateful for your time, your attention. Please be safe. Please be compassionate and kind to one another. And let's work together in improving this world we're in.
If you've enjoyed these programs, please consider giving a contribution to Poets House. For more than 30 years, they've kept the door wide open to everyone for the joy of poetry. Recently, they have temporarily had to shut the door and are reeling from the financial implications. Please give, even a small donation if you can. Thank you.